The history and the future of the Pacific Islands and the United States are inextricably linked. We have historic bonds going back generations and shared fights for freedom and for liberty.
The United States has long had a presence in the Pacific, but for some time now that presence has been waning.
We recognize that in recent years, the Pacific Islands may not have received the diplomatic attention and support that you deserve. So today I am here to tell you directly, we are going to change that.
The US Vice President today pledged to open new embassies in Tonga and Kiribati, as well as appointing an envoy to the Pacific Islands Forum. The US Peace Corps will be deployed to the region, and aid to the Pacific will be nearly tripled to US $60 million a year for the next decade.
The folk memory in the US of the Second World War was very important in terms of its engagement in the region. That memory has become much, much fainter in the US. So there is less substance to the relationships between the US and those countries south of the Pacific. What we're seeing now is evidence that the Pacific is a much higher priority than it has been in previous decades.
There's little suggestion Beijing will be swayed in its attempts to exert influence in this strategically important part of the world. Kamala Harris's speech meant much more than just the words she used. The United States and Australia are now realising that for many years they took for granted the Pacific.
In this region and around the world, the United States believes it is important to strengthen the international rules-based order, to defend it, to promote it, and to build on it. These international rules and norms have brought peace and stability to the Pacific for more than 75 years.
The announcement was delivered via video to Pacific Island leaders, including Australia and New Zealand. China wasn't officially invited to the forum, but two Chinese embassy officials who were based in Suva, the Defence Attaché and Deputy Defence Attaché, managed to work their way into the room where Kamala Harris's remarks were being heard. It caused a minor stir. They were asked to leave, but managed to hear what the Vice President had to say first.
At a time when we see bad actors seeking to undermine the rules-based order, we must stand united.
At the end of the Cold War, the US actually withdrew from the Pacific Islands. The US closed down embassies. And now, for the first time since the end of the Cold War, Pacific Islands are back on the map in terms of great power competition.
The sense was that this was, as I say, a reasonably benign part of the world in which Australia and New Zealand had responsibilities leading with issues of development and security. That's changed with the posture of China over the last few years, and that's what's grabbed the attention of the US.
What we've seen in the past years is a growing interference in our internal affairs from China.
Kiribati's government refused to participate in this week's forum. The opposition leader blames China for the disunity.
I do think that China is behind the decision of my government to pull out of the forum. Our country and the Solomon Islands are probably two countries that are very, very aligned towards the Chinese partnership.
Australia's new government has been welcomed here in Suva. Prime Minister Albanese's desire to act on climate change is seen as a welcome change to leaders in this part of the world.
There's no challenge more important than climate change. But we also have engagement with the region, including increased funding and support for climate change infrastructure.
You are on the front lines of an existential crisis for our entire planet, but you are on the front lines. And the world's emissions have had an outsized impact on your nations.
Pacific Island countries have been crystal clear for decades that their key security priority is not geostrategic competition, it's actually climate change. And so they were looking for countries to be talking about how they're going to address that threat.
But there's little suggestion that Beijing will be swayed in its attempts to exert influence in this strategically important part of the world.
I don't think there's any sign, any signal that China intends to pull back from its assertive attempts not only to cultivate influence in the Pacific but to disrupt the interests of countries like Australia and the United States in the Pacific. If the geostrategic competition increases in the region, I think more Pacific Island countries will feel these pressures.
I think Beijing will try again to negotiate a regional security pact with Pacific leaders.
We're probably again becoming a theatre for these competitions to try and I guess win the hearts of the Pacific. I mean, this is a competition between the major powers, and we're caught in the middle.